see if I can share my screen. Beautiful. Okay. Hi, everyone. Uh, we're going to start now. So, hi, my name is Amitai. I'm going to be talking to you all about finance today. And I'll make a few caveats before we get into the presentation itself. The first is that this is sadly not a topic to be covered in 1 hour. So we'll see how much we get through today. I'll tell you about the sort of split I've made in the presentation. Um, but if we get through all the content today, that probably means we're going to have to cover some things superficially. And the more important thing it's going to mean is that we're going to run through some things very quickly. And while this workshop is called Intermediary Finance, it's actually on the more challenging side relative to understanding more basic concepts in finance, which this workshop won't do and will sort of assume. The reason that's important is because that means that you should be very, very, very comfortable with asking questions or stopping to understand the chain a bit more deeply. Otherwise, we will run the risk of this going too fast and us losing some people out while we're going on. So please do feel comfortable interrupting me at any moment. The other thing is that I'm deathly ill, as you might be able to hear, which is a hoot and a half. Um, but yeah, I guess we will all prepare towards my nasally voice, and also you just another question to another reason to ask me questions. It will give me a second to uh, cough with an excuse of being muted. Um, but yeah, we should be able to start now. I will say one comment in terms of the workshop itself. So the my approach to workshops that have to do with topics in debate as opposed to skills in debate is that it's usually unhelpful to cover skills in a very abstract and sort of like a TLDR or crash course perspective. I think explaining finance in a way that is disconnected from debate will not do you a lot of good. So, what I will want to do more in this workshop is talk about all sorts of characteristics of different aspects of finance that I think you can pick and plug into your cases. Sort of, you can imagine it as a country profile, but for financial systems. We're just going to be adding all sorts of facts or all sorts of relationships between things that you could then weaponize um, as things that explain or show premises within cases. And for that reason, since we will make a lot of sort of small cheat sheet additions to your understanding of finance, I suggest you have something to write with because we're not telling like one singular story that's important in terms of understanding. We're going to cover a lot of disjointed parts. And if you want to retain this for your next debate, I would highly suggest writing it. Um, that's in terms of the format of the workshop. Finally, in terms of the actual topics we're going to cover today, we're going to cover two broad um, topics, and hopefully the third we'll get to with some amount of depth. So, the first thing we're going to talk about is currencies, and within that, we're going to talk about monetary policy. The second thing we'll talk about is financial markets and different types of financial actors and how they interact. And the final thing we'll talk about is banks. Um, cool. Are there any questions before we dive in? Cool, cool, cool. Okay, so we should be good to start with the presentation. Can you all see this as like big part of my screen right now? Great. Um, so now after we moved on from my beautiful cheesy title, we can talk about the two sub-subjects within what I told you before. So within currency, we're going to start by actually talking about monetary policy or the way that that dictates currencies. And then we'll talk more about characteristics of currencies also in an international context. And then when we talk about financial markets, we're going to really split it up into corporate finance and financial investment, as well as banking. Let's start with the currency. And what I want to cover here is first the purpose of central banks, then currency dilemmas and differences between different levels of the currency, and finally, the dollar as the world's reserve. Central banks. I want to start by clarifying a little bit what they do and how they're mostly viewed. So, can someone try and give me a TLDR of what central bank's monetary policy is? Anyone you can just speak up. What is monetary policy? Okay, so that's good, that's close. Interest rates are a way in which central banks affect monetary policy. What's monetary policy more broadly?
Um,
Yeah,
is monetary policy relating to the actions that a central bank take in order to manage money flow and increase economic growth?
yeah, okay, good. So economic growth is a sort of desired consequence of monetary policy. And but I think you're getting close to the broad definition of monetary policy, which is that this is policy that tries to regulate the supply of money in an economy. So sort of if you think of money as a good, like if you think of it as disks, monetary policy is simply intended to control the amount of disks in each country. Um, Obviously, this has a lot of consequences. So, for example, the amount of disks decides the price of each disk, or the interest rate of giving away a disk, or the value of disks themselves, etc. But all of these things stem from the central question of monetary policy, which is how much money supply is there in a given economy. So central banks control this part of policy. They dictate monetary policy through a few tools that we're going to talk about in a second. But very importantly, we need to contrast what central banks do with what the government does, which is fiscal policy. Can someone tell me what fiscal policy is? Again, I don't know if you guys are raising hands, but I can't see it because I'm looking at the presentation, so you guys can just speak up.
I would say it's the way that governments impose tax. So like, the assumption here is that governments are able to determine to what like how big is the tax are being imposed on people or businesses in that sense.
Very good. Okay, so fiscal policy is spending and taxation by the government. Importantly, it's not just taxation because the government has other sources of money that we'll talk about in a second. Part of them is really the money that they get through monetary policy, through bonds. Um, well, bonds are through things that affect monetary policy, like issuing debt. Um, but essentially, fiscal policy has to do with the effects on the economy that come from government spending and from government collection of money. Okay? So, any policy, things like subsidies, are things that are fiscal policy and not monetary policy. They don't control, they could affect, but they don't control and they don't aim to control the supply of money in an economy. They tend to have macroeconomic effects that are industrial, not necessarily related to currency. And similarly, taxation is a sort of government policy in order to control money. Um, and so, in order to control money and increase spending, it is not what we would consider a policy aimed at changing the supply of money in an economy. Okay? You can sort of think about it as fiscal policy is about the same amount of money in an economy. It just goes through an intermediary, which is the government. So the government taxes and then uses that money in policy, whereas monetary policy tries to uh, limit, contract, or expand the amount of money that exists overall in an economy, not just redirect it. Okay, this distinction is very important because I think oftentimes people don't understand what central bank can and can't do. All of the tools we're going to talk about today are monetary policy tools. There is no bank in the world that's able to control fiscal policy. In fact, you all might remember the Worlds 2022 round six, I believe, which was about whether in times of crisis central banks should be able to implement fiscal central banking, as in to expand their capacities into fiscal policy as well. Because right now, that is not the status quo anywhere. Okay, what are some characteristics of central banks? The first important characteristic is that they are the aspect of them that is most respected internationally is their independence from the government. And this is because of the fact that, much like many other government offices and other parts of the bureaucracy, the central bank is an institution that must be technocratic. It requires a great deal of expertise in the policy making that it does, one that is definitely very detached from the skill set that a politician is elected into. And so this is the broad justification for keeping it independent from the political arena. But there is a more substantial justification for this, which makes the central bank more commonly independent than some other offices that are also technocratic, like the like whatever entity controls taxes in a state or something like that. Right? Like those offices are still often headed by a minister from the cabinet. This hopefully isn't true about the central bank, that is independent in most countries completely, where the president of the central bank will often be will not often have political affiliations with the government, and that most of the government will have some power nominations, completely like, very much the same like a Supreme Court. Um, can someone venture a guess as to why central banks have this decreased level of independence relative to things like the finance ministry? So the reason that it is the case is that in a lot of economic theory, there is a consensus that there is a principal agent problem between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Does anyone know what a principal agent problem is? Come on, friends. I know people know what a principal agent problem is.
Is it like who to benefit or like who are the primary constituents you want to serve? I guess like um what I know, or maybe I might have been referring this to the wrong idea or like, attributing this to the wrong idea, but it's just maybe in the idea of central banks, it might be the case where they want to have more profit, or do they prioritize their consumers more, for example? Maybe it's the similar idea to it finance towards like the board of directors or the profit or the normal citizens and all of those things, but maybe somewhere along the lines of that.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, this is the application of the principal agent problem in this case is a little different, but the broad idea is correct. A principal agent problem is when you entrust an actor with doing something, but the actor has reasons to, out of their own interests, to handle the task that you're giving them in a different way than you intended for them to do. So they don't necessarily perform the task. Their primary incentive isn't necessarily adherence to the way that you told them to perform the task. And this is a common consensus in economics about the way that governments handle monetary policy. There's a principal agent problem where the public entrusts them the authority to handle monetary policy well, but they have reasons to want to handle it poorly, which is that relative to fiscal policy, governments want to prioritize their fiscal space and having a fiscal freedom as opposed to the quality of monetary policy that they pass. Why do you think this trade-off exists? What's the tension between good monetary policy and good fiscal policy? The trade-off is spending, right? So a government increases the amount of money that exists in an economy if it takes on more debt and spends more. And this can help fiscal policy a lot. It gives you a lot of policy space in terms of what you can push for. And that means there's a lot of electoral benefits to reap from having more money to spend as a government. But it also hurts monetary policy because it affects the supply of money for reasons that don't have to do with fixing issues in the supply of money. Um, which means that, as we'll see in a second, it changes currency levels in a way that is undesired. So the problem with governments is that they want to use fiscal policy in order to enhance the policy freedom that they have. And this often comes at the expense of monetary policy because they know that fiscal policy is more directly attributable to them. Policies that they pass and can have their name stamped on are going to more likely be recognized as something that has to do with that political candidate than, I don't know, rising levels of debt or influences on the currency. So they very typically prioritize fiscal policy over monetary policy. And that's why there's a principal agent problem with the government. This has sort of made room for the theory of the conservative social banker, which again is a common idea in economics that says the social banker must be more conservative towards spending in order to remain an actor that's able to counterbalance the fiscal influences, the counter productive fiscal influences that the government has in terms of monetary policy. The social banker must be there to control monetary policy and to balance it against the government. So, sort of, it's not just that the central bank is entrusted with being independent because the government isn't, it's also that its function and the way that economists vying to be a central banker, the sort of theories that they're operating on, is that it's not just separate but a counterbalance to the government that often uses fiscal policies that indirectly hurt monetary policy. The central bank needs to moderate those tendencies by governments to overspend and should lean towards that. Okay? The next two characteristics that are important are that central banks are national and specific to a nation, kind of, again, like a Supreme Court. You might ask yourself why this is inherent. Indeed, like the European Central Bank has a single central bank across many countries. Can anyone venture a guess as to why central banks mostly have to be only national?
Because they can print money.
Sorry?
Because they can print money.
Yes. So both of these things are correct, which is that countries have very different circumstances and also the central bank's effect on an economy, say if they print money, are things that you would usually want to have reserved only for your country if you're trying to influence conditions in it. But the broader issue with it, because there's like, obviously there could be like differences within countries as well, or there could be broad similarities between countries that are, um, for example, in Mercosur, uh, right, in South America, where there was a proposed idea to have a single central bank. So there could be similarities between different economies, even though you're right that usually there aren't. The reason that that still usually means it's impossible to have a single central bank is because that requires a single currency. It is impossible for central banks to control more than one currency in circulation. Not impossible, but extremely difficult, because that means that you have to affect the concurrent and parallel influences on multiple currencies. So, for example, central bank policy is already very hard to anticipate for reasons we'll see in a second. But if you not only have to raise the interest rate in order to limit borrowing for the dollar as the Federal Reserve, the Fed, that's the central bank in the US. So if you not only have to lower the value of the dollar through raising interest rates, but by lowering interest rates, you don't only anticipate the value of the dollar to drop. You also have to factor in what this will do indirectly to the other currency in circulation in the US and the one that's being used in Mexico or the one that's being used in Colombia, etc. It makes it extremely difficult for policymaking to be predictable and for policymaking to necessarily achieve its goals. Because if you raise interest rates, for example, across the currencies, and one currency that's stronger than the other drops, but the other drops as well, and it gets to be too weak such that you can't import or whatever, this means that you're bound by those divergent levels of the currencies, and so you can't do too much changes because one will drop one too low and the other will raise another too high. So the point is just that multiple currencies make it almost impossible to regulate monetary policy. So you need a single currency in order to do that. The other reason, and this is even more important, because indeed there are certain central banks like the ECB that are between multiple countries. Obviously, those countries are all adopting the euro, but presumably Brazil and Argentina could also agree to adopt a single currency, right? And then have a single central bank. The problem with those cases is that there's an additional burden, which is that fiscal policies between these countries might be different. So, since they have different governments, they could push for different levels of taxation or different levels of spending, which then influences the country next to it a lot, right? And you can't always position yourself as a central bank to respond to the government because there are two different ones that are doing different actions. So you can't respond to both concurrently, which is why you need two different entities in order to respond to two different governments. This, of course, doesn't mean that a central bank hasn't been tried over many countries. When many countries have one currency, it often makes the most sense. But it is also a problem in areas where you have the same currency. So, for example, in the European Union, this tension between a joint central bank but having local governments with fiscal policy is a big tension surrounding the euro. And it's the reason that the euro will never be a completely trusted currency, because its central bank is somewhat weak when it has to face with divergent fiscal policy and can't always adjust to all of those. Okay, is that clear? Okay, I'm just listing at the bottom, by the way, names of important central banks. So the Fed is one of them, just as a buzzword you might hear. The ECB is the other. We talked about the European Central Bank. The BOE is the Bank of England. That was the most important central bank for many decades. It is still quite an important central bank. And the BOJ is the Bank of Japan. That's also an important central bank because it's the one that it's the one most notorious for doing a practice we're going to talk about in a second. Okay. After all this overview of monetary policy and of the central bank's function and characteristics, let's talk about what are the tools that it can use in order to influence the amount of money in the economy. So, also you have some Hebrew sprinkled in there from when I had to do this lecture for the IDL, so you can ignore that. So, the first tool that you guys probably know the most about, and indeed was already mentioned, is printing money. Can someone tell me the name what, like the name of the policy in which central banks print money? There's a specific name.
Um, I might be completely wrong, but is it called helicopter money or something along those lines?
Yes, helicopter money is can also be fiscal, but it can also be monetary, where you distribute money directly to citizens. But it requires obviously the government to support handouts. Printing money can be more broad. You could also print money and not necessarily give it to people. You could give it to the government instead, or to corporations. Um, but what is the more no? So liquidating has to do with firms selling off their assets. Okay, so the name for printing money as a
It's
policy is
called
quantitative.
expansionary monetary policy.
Yes, it's a subset within expansionary monetary policy called QE, quantitative easing. Okay, um, quantitative easing is a policy that's the sort of on the extreme end of the tools that are available to the central bank. It's a policy where you try to very rapidly increase the amount of money in an economy in order to stimulate economic activity. So printing money is reserved for those cases. Central banks don't want to do it in typical times because it's a very interventionist tool to print more money, and it always runs the risk of decreasing confidence in your currency. So you usually only do it in times of crisis where you really want to stimulate economic activity. The second and more prevalent tool of central banks use, and this is the one that they use in day-to-day operations called open market operations, when they're just managing interest rate, even when it's at low levels, where even when it's at healthy levels, they try to keep it at that balance. These are the tools they use in those instances and also in times of crisis. That is to sell and buy government bonds. Does anyone know what a government bond is?
It's something that the government sells that they will pay at a later date, which they use the money for, like garnering spending.
Excellent. Okay. So a government bond is a piece of paper that says, "Hi, I am the government. You are now giving me X amount of money. I am going to give you Y amount of money in Z amount of years." And this what I just said explains how any lending works, right? But what's unique to government bonds is a few things. First, it's not a stock. You don't. It's not like investing in a corporation and then getting your dividends later. You are not investing in the government. The government is just issuing debt. It just uses you as if you were a bank that it's lending from. It says, "I am taking this amount of money from you and I'll return this money to you in the future. I'll give it back to you," okay? But this is an agreement in terms of the amount of money is supposed to be predetermined in this agreement. There's nothing about the government's function that's supposed to influence the amount of money that you get paid back. It's just simply paid on the basis of how much debt the government took from you. The second thing that's important to know about bonds is that they tend to have very low interest rates. So the amount of money that you'll get back in 5 years is going to be very close to the amount of money that you paid to the government. You might get $5 more if you paid 100. Can anyone venture a guess as to why interest rates are so low on bonds?
Because of the numerous factors that you can't really account to, such as inflation and other policies that happened in between that time.
Right, but that would actually indicate that interest rates have to be high, right? Because if you are scared of what will happen in the next few years in terms of the value of the bond, then you as an investor want to demand a high interest rate on that bond because it's uncertain. So since interest rates are low, what that tells us is that for some reason the market really, really wants these bonds. What are the reasons that the market might want bonds?
Because it saved the money, stay with the government, so have a we know that the money will be coming back, so we are not losing that money in any case.
Excellent. Okay. Governments are more stable than other actors that you could lend from. They are not going to default. I mean, obviously they could default, but they won't go bankrupt the same way a bank or a corporation could. Government will always either get bailed out or will be able to debt restructure or will be supported by the international community or whatever it may be. States are sort of too big and too important to fail, in most cases, obviously. And that means that there's a sort of there's a floor to whether or not the government will to what the government is able to do in terms of not paying you back. You don't really run the risk that you won't get anything from the government. The worst risk you're running is that the government will decide it must pay you less or that it takes longer to pay you back, but it won't collapse and end up not paying you. The other reason is that other than just like the threat of collapse being lower, governments are also um, uh, actors that will always need money and will always keep issuing bonds and will usually always be perceived, for the reason we mentioned, to be able to pay back on those bonds, which means that you have a guaranteed demand that the bonds you're buying will be demanded at some point in the market because everyone knows that the bonds continue to have value over time. So bonds could be what we call a very liquid asset. They could be an asset that's very easy to cash out on at any given moment and to sell to others, especially if they're the bonds of very developed economies or very trustworthy economies like the US. Okay? Yeah.
Hello. So I had a question. What does debt restructuring often mean, especially in the context of, let's say, a country or like a company? Like, what exactly is done in the process of debt restructuring?
Great question. We'll get to it more when we talk about the corporate finance, but debt restructuring very quickly is the process when you realize you can't pay creditors back, um, given your current management of your finances, and then you cooperate with those creditors or with another outside actor. In the case of countries, it's often the IMF. You cooperate with them in order to restructure and create a payment plan for those creditors that makes it somewhat trustworthy. You can pay it back. But it's also a process where you negotiate with the creditors to maybe lower some amount of debt on you, since at the end of the day, creditors are displeased that you have gotten to a point that you can't pay them back, but they would rather have a payment plan that ensures they get some money back rather than having nothing at all. So this is sort of what goes into debt restructuring. It's just negotiations on debt repaying. Okay?
Can I just
Yep.
quickly
Thank you.
ask about just the bonds again? So you do explain why there's a perpetual demand for these government bonds and why they're more stable than other forms of, let's say, stashing your money. But that I feel like that still doesn't explain why governments deliberately want these bonds to be stable. Is it to lower the incentives that the average person has to like buy these bonds? Like, do they want less people to buy these bonds? Like, what is it?
Sorry, why do governments do what? You cut out for a second there.
I mean, I understand that governments are more stable in other forms of in like places that you could invest your money, and that there's a perpetual demand for these government bonds
Yeah,
in the market. But why are interest rates on these bonds really low? Because
gotcha question. So the
less
question is, why is the
who
interest
are
rate low?
yeah
Just because the government bonds are stable. Am I right?
yeah that's what I mean.
Okay. So government bonds, and it's very useful to do this exercise of using these sort of terms that we're used to treating as more complicated than average market dynamics, just plugging them into the most simple economic context we can imagine. Let's say that bonds are just the discs we talked about from before. But there's no reason that bonds should be treated as any less of a commodity than other things in finance. This is actually, again, one of the best mental tricks to do when thinking about finance. You can think of many financial assets, even if it's unintuitive to do so, you can just think of them as commodities. So government bonds don't sound like commodities because they're like a way of the government to issue debt, right? But they're actually a commodity in and of themselves. They're just a piece of paper that says you're going to get some money back. So they're traded as a commodity in and of themselves. So that dynamic is helpful to understand why it is that interest rates have to be low. Because if interest rates are in effect setting the price on bonds, okay, and if the interest rate, if the demand for those bonds is high, that means the government just gets to lower the to like higher heighten the price of the bond, which means that you increase the price in a sense because you don't pay back as much, and so the cost to the government from issuing these bonds is lower because it's imposing more of the debt paying burden on the individual that's buying the bond right now than it would on itself to pay back that bond in the future. And it is able to do that. It will always want to do that because that just means it's less in debt in the future. And it is able to do that because many people want to buy government bonds. But obviously, it depends on which country we're talking about. The reason that, for example, the 1997 Asian financial crisis happened is because of a series of events related to Russia's bonds that got so massively um, unwanted by investors given Russia's financial situation that Russia had to hike its interest rate to 17% relative to the typical 2% area that you charge on bonds in countries like the US. So obviously these things can change and they're not permanent, but usually if a government is stable and if investors perceive the government as stable, there's just too much demand for bonds for and governments are then able to use this to set low interest on them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks so much. That was a great answer.
Great. So there are two kinds of important bonds to think about. This is in the US context, but it's also true outside of it. There are short-term bonds, which in the US are called T bills, treasury bills. And those are the most common form of asset that the central bank trades in. And they are owned for 1 year or less. And then there's the second kind of bonds, which are T bonds, and they last for 5, 10, or 20 years. And in many other countries, there are similar like options of medium run, like 5 years, or long run, like 10 and 20 years. Um, and they're used a little less commonly. Um, by the way, can someone guess why those T bonds are used less than those T bills?
Because the stability is less assured.
Okay. So the reason is if an asset is going to come to fruition in 5 days, like if the disc I'm selling you is going to disappear in 5 days, there's more chance that the central bank can anticipate its effect, right? So if I release bonds and those bonds are going to exist for the next 10 years and the government has to pay them back only in 10 years, then the central bank is able to less anticipate how those T bonds will affect the economy in terms of how they'll be traded after between different actors. And T bills are more predictable because they come to fruition very quickly. The other thing is that investors tend to like T bills more, at least in stable economic periods, because T bills are very safe. The government's condition probably won't change massively within a week. It could change in 10 years, and so they're much more certain investments in terms of the capacity of the government to pay back and the desirability of the T bill in the open market. Um, so the way that the central bank uses bonds is that since it has a large amount of its government's bonds, it holds a lot of debt. And this is a little unintuitive, so I'll just explain this for a second. A lot of the government debt that gets issued, that it then promises people it will pay back, is debt that ends up in the hands of the central bank. So the central bank is actually often the actor that owns the most debt by its government. It has the most papers that say the government will pay you back at some point in time. Okay, and it buys these bonds from many domestic banks in its economy or from foreign banks. And so what it does is it can use these bonds that it has access to, or these T bills, in order to increase or decrease the amount of money in the economy. So if it buys bonds from banks in the economy, what that does is it releases money into the economy, right? Because you give me a disc, I give you money, you can now take that money and spend it wherever you want. It can also sell government bonds, in which case you take money from the average person who's paying you for a bond or from the average bank, and instead you give them a bond that might come into fruition in 5 years, which they can't pay for stuff with now. So this is a way in which the central bank can control the amount of money that goes in and out of an economy. Okay? Other questions
Sorry,
about that?
while on the note of government bonds, I'm a bit confused because this is like somewhat of a foreign subject for me. How do you think this applies in debate? Like, to what extent should we explain, like, firstly, to what extent should we explain the idea of government bonds? B, what is the application of this in terms of like what type of um, clashes is this likely to exist?
Yeah,
Likely to exist as a result of this?
great question. So I'll answer the second thing when we talk about the influences of changing the amount of money in an economy. But the way that what I'm explaining right now is important to you relative to just a general understanding that central banks can set or lower interest rates is that it is very helpful to understand the tools that central banks use, because then you are able to explain how effects on the government debt or effects on central banks policy cross-pollinate. What do I mean by that? For example, if the motion is about the central bank setting low interest rates, or the central bank trying to increase the monetary the supply of money in the economy, what you now know is that the central bank does this by selling a lot of bonds. And what you can infer from that is, okay, now I not just know that it tries to release money into the economy, I know that it tries to release government debt into the economy. And there are many extrapolations you can make from that. You can say maybe the government's economic functions are discredited now because its debt is sold en masse, so its bonds are less desired. So it can take out less debt, right? Because its bonds are now, investors want a higher interest rate on them because there are so many in the economy. So the supply catches up with the demand, for example. And this is something you can develop out of knowing the way in which the central bank does policy and not just the broadness of it. In terms of whether you need to explain what government bonds are, no. The average intelligent voter should know what a bond is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers most of my question. I just have a follow-up question in regards to your answer. Do you think strategy-wise, because I noticed in lots of debates, the explanation kind of varies. Do you think like it's helpful to debate in terms of like central bank motions to just explain the concepts and like make the what you just mentioned, like the depth kind of gets spread out to the mass as an impact, or like explain the extrapolate the impacts towards like smaller actors and explain what it means to like subsections of the population, if that makes sense.
So I'm not sure I understand completely, but nevertheless, that sounds more motion dependent. You can obviously do both by explaining why you release more government debt, right? And so I guess the question is more which impact do you think you want to use in a round rather than which impact is more plausible from this dynamic. Okay. The next tool I want to briefly talk about is the reserve requirement or the reserve ratio. The reserve ratio is a tool that central banks can use to just force banks to keep X amount of money saved rather than invested in other assets, right? So let me give you a very quick preview on banks, which we'll talk about more later. Banks are either commercial banks or investment banks. Commercial banks just store your money. They can give money to investment banks, but they're not supposed to invest it based on a wish to increase profit. Their main motivation should be to make it so everyone can withdraw cash at any given moment from the bank, or at the very least to keep the same amount of money that's deposited into them. And investment banks are investment actors, so they take money that's deposited in them and they invest it with the purpose of increasing profits, which is an important distinction. But anyway, the central bank can force commercial banks to save a certain amount of the deposits that are in them in cash and not invest it into other assets, which commercial banks often do. So, for example, if 20 people put money into the commercial bank, if the reserve ratio is 20%, that means the central bank has to has to keep the money of a fifth of the people that deposited in it. So 4 people's deposits stay in the central bank in their vault, whatever, and it can only deposit the remaining 16 people's money. Okay, and if the reserve ratio was 10%, you could do it with you would only have to keep the money of 2 people, and you could use the money of the 18 others to invest. And the idea behind a reserve requirement is both that you could limit the amount of money used in the economy, because if banks can't invest a lot of the money that they're getting and they have to save it, obviously that decreases the supply of money. But also, this is not necessarily a question of wanting to regulate the money supply, as much as it's the central bank trying to intervene to prevent a collapse of certain banks that might be a little too risk taking in the way that they deposits placed in them in other areas of the economy. So maybe you want to force a bank to keep some level of insurance in the amount of deposits that it's keeping. Next, and we'll only do reserves because this is the last very important one. Can someone tell me what a central bank's reserves are? Yes, okay. A reserve is literally just a central bank's money. Like, reserves are central bank's wallets. You remember, as mentioned before, they buy or sell government bonds. The money they accumulate or use in order to do that is the central bank's reserve. And indeed, as you just said, they often have those reserves in a multiplicity of currencies. It's not just their own currency, because they want to make sure they have purchasing power even if their own currency fails. So a lot of reserves are kept in foreign currencies, most prominently the dollar. Okay. Now, what happens is that many times the central bank loans. So this is a central bank's reserves. That's one thing. It's independent. Sometimes the central bank lends some of its reserves, some of its money, to banks that need it in an economy. Okay. So you could make the pitch as a bank that you're really struggling and you need central bank backing, etc. What the central bank then does is that it uses this lever of having its own reserves in the economy in order to increase or decrease interest rates on the reserves that it's giving to central banks, to investment banks, right? So the central bank says, I am giving you money now, you pay me back in the future. And by doing that, it decreases the amount of money that it expunges into investment banks and commercial banks. So if the interest rate that they set on their reserves is higher, less banks will want to take out money from the central bank, which means they have less disposable money. So this is another way in which they regulate how much money banks have. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So this is just an illustration of the policy that we have talked about before. We start out with selling or buying bonds from the economy. And this is the first step of each of them. If you want to be expansionary, that is to say, if you want to release money into the economy, you use your reserves to buy government bonds. And if you want to be contractionary, that is to limit the amount of money in the economy, you sell those bonds in order to release money into the economy. You sell those bonds in order to expunge money from the economy. So you want to gather up the money that's used in those transactions by banks to limit them from using that money. Indeed, both of the second steps explain this dynamic, right? Banks now earn money from selling their bonds to the central bank so they can use this money. And the second step in a contractionary policy is that the banks buy the bonds and lose money. The third step is that the banks now affect other parts of the economy in terms of the amount of money that they have available. So if a bank has less money available because it bought many government bonds, it is less able to offer mortgage loans and it charges higher interest rates on them. It's less able to loan out to households in distress or to corporations that want to start up, etc. Which means that then you have less money to trade between different corporations. So you cease operations a little bit. All of these are the ways in which that sort of trickles down into an economic cool down or an economic stimulation. Cool. This is the most important dynamic to understand within the section of currency in this lecture, because I really think that it gives you a lot of grounding policy, a grounded policy perspective on how the central bank works that you can then use in order to explain many lines of analysis that you maybe didn't think about before. Again, in terms of like how it influences government debt or why it's hard and unpredictable, the way that government debt will be perceived in the economy after the central bank releases it, etc. So do let me know if you have any more questions on this before we move on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the expansionary policy, so when these banks now have much more amount of money which they can offer through loans, so basically since a large amount of money is now going into the economy, so the chances of inflation increases and there is a high risk of being a lot of inflation due to a large supply of money in the economy. So how does the like central bank regulate that?
Excellent. So more money creates more inflation, less money creates deflation, right? Deflation means the currency's value begins to rise too much. And so it's much harder to like that increases prices in itself as well. And it can be bad for causing economic cool downs if no one wants to buy your stuff. And inflation is when there's too much money, and so prices start rising even more. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But the answer to your question is just sometimes the central bank prioritizes injecting money, even if it risks inflation, because it wants to stimulate growth. So if households aren't spending and companies aren't making enough profit, you need to give some money, you need to sort of give the fuel in order to get an economy starting again. And that's worth the risk of this money that you're injecting sort of overheating and causing an inflation, because generally inflations are less bad than deflations. Because in inflations, you're limiting the amount of things that people can buy, you're imposing some sort of financial constraint on them, but the risk is much less severe than that of a lack of spending, which can cause collapses that are irreparable. Okay?
So basically the like economy is taking a trade-off, like they are giving inflation just to increase the economic activity so that people's
Yes.
spending power increases.
Yes, and as we said before, there is a delicate balance where the central bank will obviously want to shoot for the healthy range, because there's a healthy range of like very low inflation, which is the best for countries, where growth happens, but it happens slowly. Central banks often very much struggle with getting to that sweet spot, because as we mentioned before, there are many, many ways in which, given the analysis we went through, you can analyze why the central bank's policy goes through so many steps that it's often very unpredictable. So central banks many times end up overshooting and leading to the inflation area, or undershooting and still remaining within a low growth situation. But they do make the trade-off that it's worth it for them, even for the chance that they overshoot in certain cases.
All
Okay.
right, understood. Another follow-up question.
Yeah.
Like, what mechanization could you provide to prove that like injecting money in the economy would necessarily lead to economic activity for the people? Like, what mech can I give to prove this?
Um, so one is what I mentioned in terms of the capacity of banks to offer loans. This is probably the most direct path. Mortgages, car loans, health insurance loans, etc. The second is corporate loans, which means the ability to expand as a corporation, which offers more jobs and wages through those jobs. And also means, building of infrastructure in service of that factory, or higher tax revenue that the government then sends back to people. These are generally the ways that you talk about that money trickling down.
All right, thanks a lot.
Sure, cool. Now I want to talk about something different within currencies. It's not about regulating how much is in the economy. It's sort of looking a bit more at the international relations between different currencies. A currency's value can be determined either as a fix, also called a peg, or it could float. Does anyone know what the distinction between these two means? So, a fixed currency is one that the central bank says what is the exchange rate between this country's currency and another global commodity or currency. So, for example, if I take my disk and I compare it to Haman's disk, and I say my disk is always going to be worth 2 of your disks. So anyone that wants to get one of my disks needs to give me 2 of your disks, and that's what I'm saying is the value of my disk. Okay, now we all know what the value of my disk is. What does that force me to do in order to make this promise credible? So I have to maintain money, right, to give back. Um, if I don't have like if I don't have many discs to give out, or if I don't have, like, if someone wants to cash out of my discs and say, give me 2 of Himan's discs in return for mine, I need to have some of Himan's discs in order to be able to do that. Otherwise, the value of my currency is completely bogus, right? It's a lie that I tell investors. And if they want to cash out, it's not actually worth 2 of Himan's discs. So in order for a fix to work, central banks need to make it credible that the value that they're setting is actually the value of that currency, which is why in a perfect fix, like in an ideal fixed system, the central bank needs to ensure that anyone who wants to convert based on the exchange rate that the central bank is setting is able to do that. So they need to have enough reserves in Himan's discs in order for every investor that wants to come up to the central bank and say, give me 2 of Himan's discs instead of this one disc of this country, they have to say okay and give Himan his 2 discs. And obviously central banks don't have enough money to do that if everyone was to cash out at once. But it does mean that they need to have a credible enough amount of reserves in order to peg it, because otherwise no one believes that there's really convertibility. Okay? But anyway, that is how you fix your currency. And then there's no question of like demand or supply of your like those questions don't affect the value of your currency, because you set it as the central bank. The other system, the one that rules the world right now, is the most common one, is a float, where the exchange rate is not determined by banks. Central banks say nothing about the value of their currency. And instead, its value, by the way, exchange rate and value are synonymous in the context of currencies, because the value of the currency is only determined relative to other currencies in the world. There's no meaning to like the currency's inherent value, right? So your exchange rate is set by the market. It's just based on the demand and supply dynamic of how much people want this currency, and based on that, its value relative to other currencies gets determined. Does that make sense? There are also some systems that fix between them. For example, there's a dirty float where you usually let the market do its thing, but sometimes the central bank will like intervene for a month and say, now we're fixing it to this, and then they'll pull out after a month, and they'll have moved the float a little bit downwards or upwards. So that's another way in which central banks can intervene. Okay, now in economics, there is a term called the impossible trinity. The impossible trinity explains the tension between what a fixed currency tries to achieve and what a float tries to achieve. And that is, we won't go through all of the impossible trinity now, but essentially the impossible trinity says that monetary systems can either be globally integrated, as in people are able to pull in and out of a country's monetary system, so they're able to exchange freely. That's one characteristic. They could be fixed, which is another characteristic where you fix your interest rates, and there could be central bank monetary independence. That is to say, the central bank can decide its own policy. It can do all of the tools we talked about before. But all three of these things can't coexist. You need to pick two. And since almost all countries are globally integrated in the financial system, that is to say, it would be unrealistic and a major economic blow for them to limit the amount of money that you can take out of their economy or take in, or the exchange rate ability that you have. Some countries obviously do this, like Russia and China, but it's done, even there, it's done in crisis modes and in limited extent. Given then that you have to allow investors to do that, the question becomes, can the central bank make monetary policy, or do we have a fixed currency? And I won't explain why it's true that this dilemma exists, because it is a little complicated. If you want, you can look at the slides and ask me now. You can also tell me if you want me to explain it, but I think we might want to move on. But the way in which you can deduct things from this trade-off is that the difference between in motions that are like this house would peg to the dollar or whatever, the margin isn't just in terms of your currency versus the dollar. If you peg your currency, you also lose the capacity to do your own monetary independence. You cannot set your own policy, even if it is to gold and not to another currency. The central bank loses the ability to decide on how much money is in the economy. That is another loss of fixing. Okay?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why did most countries give up on the gold standard?
So this is exactly the question that we're currently tackling. As in, most countries preferred to have a floating system rather than a fixed system. So just for clarification, the gold standard was a system that existed for many, many years, where most countries would peg their currencies to the dollar, or for some time they would to the dollar, which was pegged to gold by the United States. So all currencies were fixed, or most currencies were fixed. And before that, there was also a time where just all countries fixed their currencies to gold. The reason that countries gave up on that is exactly the dynamic that we currently explained, which is that as economies became globally integrated, in order to continue fixing your currency, you had to give up the ability to control the amount of money in your economy. And the reason that the US, for example, gave up on the gold standard, which then, made other countries give up on it as well, is that they could not get out of the Great Depression in the 30s without greater monetary policy. It was just impossible. So they realized that the need for a central bank to have its flexibility in the way that it affects the amount of money in an economy should matter more than having a fixed exchange rate. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is something we sort of talked about before, the difference between quantitative easing and open market operations. Open market operations are just what central banks do typically. Quantitative easing is what they do in cases of a wish to inject a lot of money into the economy at once. I actually don't know why it's here. It's not directly relevant to what we just talked about, but anyway, keep that in mind. Yeah, so let's contrast for a second the consequences of a fix and the consequences of a float. Because so far we just discussed the trade-off. We didn't actually talk about what the benefits and harms are. So in terms of the consequences of a float, as we said, you have a more flexible regime because you can control the amount of money. With a fix, you can't control the amount of money. But there are other consequences as well. A float is better for domestic producers. Why? Because a fix ensures stability in trade. If you have a fixed currency and everyone knows what the value between the dollar and the euro is, there's much less fear for investors from investing into trade or from building trade between two countries. Because the fear that exists with floats is that if you constantly have to convert between the two currencies, a lot of the deals that you're making are actually quite speculative and uncertain in the long run, because you don't know if the value of the currency transfer will mean that you're making a loss or a gain. So for example, if I sell a whole lot of milk in France as opposed to the US, but then suddenly the euro loses some value, I now have to convert my profits from euros to dollars, and I end up with less dollars than I would have had if I sold the milk in the US. So this is a fear that exists, and stability in the exchange rate, the ability to know exactly what the currency level is going to be over a period of time, allows you to circumvent that because you know exactly what the transfer rates are. So this is why many times a fix encourages more international trade than a float, or at the very least makes it less expensive because you have to charge less in order to insure yourself against the risk of a currency depreciating. You don't have to charge as much, is what I mean. So this means then a few things. One, obviously it just affects international trade directly, like the amount of products in an economy are increased under a fixed immediately relative to a float, but it also changes the benefits for domestic producers versus international producers, right? Because if there's this uncertainty about trade, that's really good for domestic producers, because that means that domestic producers can get to say in their domestic markets, like, look, we're uniquely good because you don't have to transfer your currency and face this speculation in order to produce our goods and spread our goods, as opposed to international trade. Okay? The other thing is that a fix would obviously encourage long-termism relative to a float's more short-term focus, because since you know what the fix is, you're less scared of committing to a long-term deal. For example, investing in something that's going to bring you returns in euros in 10 years, because you know what the rate between the euro and the dollar is. Versus in a float, you don't know what the rate is. You don't know what will happen in 10 years. So you're more reluctant to invest into another country in a way that's long-term demanding. Okay? I think that's the more important thing to talk about. Okay, this is very important. Many motions about finance end up boiling down to a trade-off between a high level of the currency and a low level of the currency, or a high exchange rate or low exchange rate. So for example, if it's about dollarizing Argentina, we have to talk about the difference between a weak currency and which would have been the peso up until that point, and the dollar, right, which is a strong currency. But this happens in many other debates as well. For example, with quantitative easing, you would obviously be lowering the value of your currency. So if there's a motion about the central bank doing a lot of quantitative easing, now that there's inflation, that there's more money in the economy, the value of the currency drops. So it's relevant
to explain why that could be a good or a bad thing that the value drops. Okay, what are the consequences of a strong currency? First, obviously, whatever savings you currently have in that currency give you more now. So if I had $40 sitting in the bank and the dollar is now worth €2, not €1, I suddenly have 80 euros in the bank. So my ability to purchase outside goods is much greater when the currency appreciates as someone who already owns some part of that currency. Notice that obviously, since there are massive differences in the amount of wealth that different individuals and actors within countries hold, it's not an equal strengthening, right? Like the corporation that owns $80 now gets 160 euros as opposed to 80 euros. And the guy that owns $2 now gets 4 euros as opposed to $2. So it can sometimes be an exponential difference in helping the wealth of those who have more money in an economy, because their more money is now worth more relative to other currencies, compared with people that have less money. So it could sometimes exacerbate inequality. The other thing is that obviously it improves your purchasing power, not towards yourself. Like, I still have the same amount of money relative to the wealthy guy, but my amount of money relative to a bank in India changes, right? So my ability to buy more is mostly relative to other countries. Like, it encourages exports over imports. And why is the reverse true for a strong currency?
Uh, basically, I can uh, I can try to answer that. Suppose that $1 is essentially equal to 100 rupees, and a trader in US wants to imports chairs from India, and a chair is costed at 100 rupees only. So he can, at this rate, he can on $1 import one chair at this time. But suppose the currency of India actually gets stronger, and therefore the price of chair and the exchange value decreases to $1 is equal to 50. It decreases to $1 is equal to 50 rupees. Now he will have to spend $2 to actually purchase that one chair, essentially increasing the price of chair in US. On the contrary, if this exchange rate decreases to $1 is equal to 200 rupees, he will now have to spend only 50 cents, half a dollar to actually import that chair, essentially decreasing the price of chair in US only.
Excellent. Okay. So the difference is that exports are almost always competitive, right? There are many people who sell some amount of chairs. And like we just heard, the difference is that to your ability to sell is determined by how much your prices are higher relative to those other export offers. And if your currency is worth more, then even if your price is $10 per chair on either side, if the dollar gets stronger, it actually costs more rupees, even if not more dollars, because you have to use more rupees in order to transfer into the dollar and then buy the chair in dollars. Okay? But the reverse is also true, which is that if your dollar is now worth more relative to rupees, it's cheaper for you to buy a chair that's priced in rupees relative to what it was before. So higher currency level means easier to import and harder to export. Okay? Similarly, this also influences how attractive it is for foreign investors to invest in you. And the reason for that is because if your currency is worth more relative to another country's, it's easier for you to buy things in that country in order to make a large-scale investment. Relative to a situation where you have a lot of rupees in the bank as a large Indian corporation, but that still makes it very difficult to transfer them into dollars and start buying a lot of assets in the US. So the dynamic of foreign direct investment, which requires a lot of buying of assets in the country that you're investing in, is much easier when you have a higher currency from the country that you're coming from, which is why a lot of well, for that and for many other reasons, obviously, a lot of FDI comes from the West. From the West. Okay. Sorry, no. Can you rephrase? Because I thought what you were saying is that the spending capacity in India remains the same, which is true. But then you concluded by saying that the spending capacity changes relative to the U.S. as well. So explain to me why it remains the same relative to the U.S. as well. So explain to me why you think it remains the same again. I see what you're saying. You're saying um, everything we explained so far. I see. Everything we say so far about the chair's cost affects it if the chair's cost remains the same, but maybe the chair also goes from 10 to 15. Okay, yeah. So that's very true. Often, if you have a weaker currency, it will come alongside inflation, which means that you will also have a higher price for the chair. That's very true and fair. And it's a sort of self-mitigating cycle. But the problem is that usually inflation will change less relative to your currency's strength. Like the price will change less than your currency's relative strength to another currency. And the reason for that, if you think about it, is because since the consumption power of people within India doesn't change as much based on the currencies, based on whether the currency gets weaker or stronger, because it affects everyone the same way, then the fluctuations in the demand for the chair are milder than the fluctuations in the currency's value relative to the US, because the demand in India changes less than the currency's value relative to the US. And so often what will happen is maybe inflation will make the chair cost 11 rather than 10, but the rupee's drop in value will make it so that the rupee is now worth like half what the dollar is. Not half, but 0.75 what the dollar is in very quick periods of time. And so that is a bigger change. Okay. Any other questions about strong versus weak currency?
Yeah. If a financial crisis happens in the US, what's like the relative impact it would have on the countries compared to the US itself?
Great question. So, since dollars across pegged countries are convertible, as in I could leave a country that's pegged, Liberia, for example, I can leave the country and use my dollars from Liberia in the US. If the value of the dollar drops in the US, the value of the dollar drops everywhere. You can't have a dollar that's valued more in one country and less in another, because then it's not a peg, like it's another currency. And because oftentimes what that will do is, like I explained, it will create a black market where you use your Liberian dollars and you find ways to smuggle them out of Liberia and use them in the US because they're worth more. So that can't happen. So the central bank, even if it's a fix, the fix has to continue tracking the US dollar. So if the US dollar drops, the currency of Liberia will drop as well. Does that answer your question?
Right. So if the PEC countries, which are usually economically weaker, they'd face like more significant economic impacts than the US itself.
Not necessarily. The way in which that's true is that the US will have ways of dealing with the crisis, and they won't necessarily take into account what the other countries want. So Liberia and the US might be similarly affected by the dollar's value decreasing. The difference is that the US has ways that it can raise interest rates, etc., which might affect Liberia indirectly. Maybe people want the dollar less, and so that also means that the dollar's value drops in Liberia. But that doesn't necessarily affect Liberia as intensely as it does the US, because in the US, the central bank's policies will obviously be stronger. So the effect might be the same, but the US has stronger coping tools with that effect.
Okay.
Cool. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. The dollar has been, for many years, the currency that most of the world holds in their reserves. Now, who can tell me what are reserves based on our discussion over the past hour?
The accumulation and spending of the central bank.
The money that the central bank is sitting on, right? So many central banks have foreign reserves. In fact, foreign reserves might be the majority of their stack, because as I said, they want to make sure that they have spending power even if their own currency depreciates. So they want to hold a lot in foreign reserves. And around 90% of those reserves are dollars right now in the world. Similarly, the dollar is an extremely important unit for price because it's used in many, many commodities and trade. For example, if I'm South Korea and I want to be trading with Malaysia, it might make more sense for us to both trade in our dollars, as like both governments will use there is international reserves to trade in dollars, or both corporations will use reserves in dollars, as opposed to doing the whole transfer and converting from the Malaysian currency to the dollar and then back to the Korean currency, which has a lot of commission costs, etc. So this also means that around 80% of commodity trade in the world happens through dollars. And this is also enforced by the fact that the oil, internationally oil, is denominated in dollars because of the petro dollar agreements between the US and Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia agreed to price their oil barrels in dollars. So, in other words, the dollar is the most dominant currency both in international trade and in the foreign reserves that central banks hold. Okay? What does that mean? It means, first, that the US has what is being called in economics the exorbitant privilege of currency. That is to say, investors always know that the dollar is desired because the dollar is inelastically necessary for international trade, for the pricing of goods, and because it is the worth of many central banks' reserves. So everyone is interested in keeping the dollar high because everyone has procedures that go through the dollar, and because everyone has assets in the dollar. And that means that the US knows that no matter how much debt it takes on itself, people will always want US dollars because US dollars are always guaranteed to be demanded internationally. This is sort of a, if you know, too big to fail dynamic with banks, right? Where the bank can do whatever it wants because it knows that if it fails, the government has no choice but to bail it out given how important it is. This is sort of the same situation with the currencies, where the dollar knows that it is in a stage of exorbitant privilege. And what this has allowed is it has allowed the Fed, the central bank in the US, to print so many dollars or to set interest rates so low for so long without the dollar actually depreciating in the way that it would depreciate if it was another currency. Because even if the central bank is releasing so much more dollars into circulation for its households to spend, etc., people still buy dollars. People still want dollars, even if there's a greater supply, because the demand is endless. Like, everyone wants a dollar, so they know that they're able to trade internationally. And this gave the Fed much more freedom to print money constantly. Okay?
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
Does that inherently mean that the US has more leeway to quantitative easing than other countries? And that
Yes.
if other countries use quantitative easing, they're at more risk than if it was the US, like developing
Yes.
countries doing it?
Exactly. It's the exact same reasoning. But an implication of this, the other thing is that since the dollar is so widely used internationally, and this is a sort of IR influence that you can explain in debates, the US can decide who uses the dollar. It has access to preventing people from making payments using its own currency, for example. So this gives the US a lot of power through sanctions that no other country has. In terms of what this effect means internationally, the sort of downside, in a sense, to the US of having this centrality of its currency internationally is that most of its currency is not owned by the US itself. Japan holds $1.2 trillion in foreign reserves from the amount of dollars that it's just able to accumulate through trade that goes through dollars, and China has 780 billion, which is a lot of dollars as well. Why is that bad? Because it means that the value of the dollar is suddenly something that the US might lose control over. Like, if other countries have so many dollars in their foreign reserves, they essentially start being able to kind of be a mini central bank for that currency, because they can decide if they want to release a lot of money and drop the value of the dollar. And since they have so much of the dollar, there's little that the US can do to prevent them from doing so. And China, for example, that Japan wouldn't do it because of its good relationship with the US, but and obviously because of the fact that they want to retain their central bank's purchasing power. But many fears, for example, fears expressed by Trump, is that China will at some point dump a lot of its foreign reserves in government bonds of the US, in T-bills, and that will cause the dollar's value to plummet and will send the US into a massive crisis. Now, the reason that China wouldn't do this is that would hurt them as well, right? Because if the dollar is worth much less, then the yuan, the renminbi, China's currency, will be worth much more relative to it. And since China is so reliant on exports, that will be really bad for China, because as we explained before, a lower currency is more competitive for exports. But there's a fear that at some point, China will decide that this hit to export competitiveness will be worth it for them, and that they'll try to sort of catastrophically dump against the US. That's a fear that Trump expresses. We'll not talk about the historical context of how the dollar became the world reserve too much, unless you all are very interested in it. But I will say, in terms of the capacity to replace the dollar, we don't really have a frontline contender. And the consensus in economics for a very long time was that no one could really challenge the dollar's hegemony as the world's reserve currency. Now, this is getting somewhat challenged, because Trump's tariffs means that many countries are increasingly owning less and less dollars, and also that the confidence in the US to be constantly stable in the way that they manage the dollar's value is decreasing. So countries might be looking to other states into other reserve currencies, like the euro or like the renminbi, in order to replace, even if not most, some of their dollar reserves. Any questions about that?
Hi. Just a question on the China part that you mentioned earlier. So you mentioned that like China has like there's a potential that China will dump the U.S. Like USD into the market. I'm just wondering how that would look like in terms of visualization.
Can you do you have a more specific question in terms of how to visualize this?
Yeah, like because I'm not like the image is not popping in my head in terms of like how would they dump the U.S. dollar, if that makes sense.
They would start selling a lot of US bonds in the market. And what that does is, because you have to, kind of like with the chair example we talked about before, since you have to transfer into the US dollar in order to buy a bond, the amount of bonds for the US government, like the amount of bonds that are in the government, really affect the country whose bond it is, their currency value. Because if there are many, many, many bonds, then it becomes less valuable to buy, like the price of the bond drops. So maybe the bonds are more competitive. So you want to buy a bond, which means that the demand for your currency, for that currency, increases. And so the value of the currency increases as well. Similarly, if you set a high interest rate, then in a country, then that high interest rates also affect your bonds. So more people are going to want to buy the bond because it means the government pays them back more. So that also means that your currency's value could appreciate. In China's specific case, the fear is that if they dump so many of their US bonds, less people will want to buy the US bonds directly from the US with dollars. They could just buy them from China. So the demand for the dollar in order to buy US bonds will decrease.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Cool. Any other final questions before we move to the second part?
So this might sound like a silly question, because this is a motion that I've seen fairly often around euro versus the dollar. And the general consensus is that euro seems to be like a decent competitor to the dollar. What has historically been like one of the things that has stopped it, if that makes sense,
One of
from
these,
being
sorry?
as competitive?
Yeah.
What are the things that has historically stopped it from being as competitive as the dollar? Is it just historical legacy more often than not?
No, it's a great question. And the reason for this is what I said a bit earlier in the lecture. And that is the fact that um, the the euro is a currency without a state. Okay? And what that means is that there is no government that can adjust that there's no singular government that you are responding to. There are many, many governments in the EU that do versatile fiscal policies. And that decreases the trust in the euro because, unlike the Fed, that's only responding to one administration at a time, the ECB has to respond to many, many countries that use the euro in the eurozone. So it's less of a stable currency in that sense because there isn't convergence on the way that the currency is used. Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Great. Nice. Let's talk about financial markets, and this will obviously have to be a bit brief because my throat is dying, but also I believe that we had agreed to attempt to make it an hour and a half. So let's speed run a little bit. Okay, so now we're transitioning to talk about nothing that has to do with currency. I mean, these obviously like open market operations can affect the currency, but this has no direct relationship with that. We are talking about financial actors right now. So people who trade in the open market, people who sell certain assets, people who invest, etc. Okay, so this is a corporate finance component. So what I want to do is I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about the types of financial actors that exist. And the reason I want to do this is because I think, and maybe the round 6 of Worlds is the most emblematic of this. Like, I think when we talk about corporate finance and motions that relate to corporate finance, like this house regrets the specialization of specific private equity firms into certain markets or geographical areas. The reason that knowing about the types of investors that exist is important is one, because it gives you a lot of things that are inherent about those actors. For example, private equity, whereas otherwise you might be grasping for straws in terms of what about this actor is inherent that I can develop analysis from. But second, it explains to you how many actors can interact in terms of how much they're attractive to one another. So what I mean by that is it explains to you what asset is attractive to a pension fund versus a private equity fund, or which private equity fund might get along better with pension funds. That means pension funds are willing to invest in them. And that's really important because it means that you can derive a lot of characteristics about how certain parts of the economy are desired or wanted. For example, you can make cases about how certain stocks in specific firms are only acquired by a branch of companies. Let me give you an example. The Vienna IV 2025 semifinal motion that I said was about forcing bankrupt firms to go through an open market auction to sell their assets. And one smart thing that a closing team did in that round is to say, like, listen, this debate in top half is only around how the market auction affects people who engage, like who affects any random generic person who wants to invest in that company or buy its asset. But the only person and firm that really wants to buy distressed companies' assets are private equity. And that really changes the debate, because if you think about the way that private equity would deal with an open market auction, for example, it's very different than how the generic investor would deal with an open market auction. So this is why I think all of that is very relevant for debate. With that in mind, what are the types of financial actors? Let's start with the easier ones. Pension funds. Pension funds take your money and they put it into a long-term investment scheme so that they're able to pay you back that money that you pay throughout your working life into a sustainable pension. What does that mean is inherent about them? Can someone tell me?
Could you repeat the question?
What is inherent about pension funds? If their purpose is to get money from you as you in your working years and pay you that money back in later parts of your life when you're going into pension, what could be some characteristics of pension funds given this? Yeah, so that is, yeah, you're right. That's the way that pension funds work. I'm asking what might be characteristics of them as investors given this.
They need to give you guaranteed returns because, of course, people don't want to lose the money that they've earned when they were young as they get old.
Exactly, right? So if the pension fund's purpose is to provide a pension, the worst thing that could happen in terms of its reputation is a catastrophic loss of money, which means they're just not able to back pensions anymore. So their interest is first and foremost in stability. They need the money that is put into them to be something that they're able to pay back in 40 years. They can't risk losing that money. So they want stable assets. What's another characteristic? Anyone have any idea? So if they're investing in the long run and they need to give you money in 40 years when you retire, they're long-termist, right? They don't care about, well, they care less about the amount of money they're able to make from their investments right now, because the demand of the people that place money in them is to be paid back in 50 years, not in 5 years, as opposed to many other funds in which investors have short-term commitments to that fund. So they want to get paid in a year or two. Okay, so that means pension funds are more likely to invest in very long-term assets.
I have a doubt regarding that. Even if you have to return like the money like in 40 or 50 years, I don't get like why still you want higher returns simply because you have to run your own you have to run your own funds or salaries and etc. things like that.
Yeah, so that's a good question. You're right that a pension fund would typically also want some short-run returns in order to, keep expanding, keep paying its workers, etc. But the point is just that relative to other investors who both have to do these things and also pay their investors in the short run, pension funds are at least don't have the pressure of paying their depositors in the short run. That is a long-term pressure. So at least relative to other investors, they're more long-termist. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So so this is the first sort of stable investor. The second stable investor that's very worthwhile to know about is index funds. Who knows what an index fund is? Excellent. Okay. So an index fund is is just a listing that pegs to an index. What does that mean? There are indexes out there that list companies, and they list the biggest companies in an economy typically. Many different indexes do it differently. So there's the NASDAQ. There are other listings that are specific, for example, for tech firms, etc. But broadly, the index measures it by size or by the attractiveness of the stock of that company. So, for example, the S&P 500 literally just lists the 500 biggest companies in the United States, almost perfectly. It almost perfectly mirrors their size in terms of the amount of wealth they have. And so all of that means that what an index fund does is that it just takes the money deposited into it and it invests proportionally across the index that it's pegging to. So an index fund pegged to the S&P invests whatever, like divides its money up to equal fractions and invests in all of the firms of the S&P, or divides it such that a tenth goes to the first firm, and then a 20th goes to the second, 100th goes to the third, whatever. Okay? What this means is that these firms are perhaps the most stable kind that exists because they are inherently prioritizing the companies that are the largest, the companies that have the most widespread market appeal, and they're diversifying inherently. They're investing across an entire index or across the majority of an entire index. So they're very, very, very stable funds. Obviously, that also means that they get quite low returns, right? What happens is they invest in companies that are very coveted. So the assets that they are investing into will typically have very, very low interest rates. Yeah. These index funds are also often, because of their flavor for stability, a lot of index funds are operated by, owned by, or have a lot of their investment come from pension funds. And sometimes pension funds are just indexed funds. Okay? Cool. Now let's talk about our three risky investors. First, starting with private equity, which is probably the most important in the current meta. Can anyone tell me what a private equity firm is? Exactly. Okay. So what private equity does is it's a private firm. So that means it's not publicly traded. It's owned by a few people who have started the firm and whatever investors they were able to loop in. Usually in most countries, you can't have too many investors invest in a private company. So it's usually not that many investors. What they then do is they have this partnership structure where they have limited partners and general partners. So since they're private and each of their investors takes up a pretty substantial stake in the company, they are often awarded with a sort of title of being a limited partner, which means they can influence the company's policy to a more significant extent than any other investor in a publicly listed company. And then there are the general partners, who are the people who started the company and control its operation. So the way that private equity is special, though, from other many private investment firms, is that other private investment firms usually work in such a way that when you invest in it, you don't necessarily become a partner, but you still influence the running of the business, right? You can still decide if you want to pull out or whatever. Private equity is often different. Since you become a limited partner, you get a lot more of the revenues that the company makes. But typically, that comes with the trade-off of you can't affect the way that the company makes decisions as much. So private equity gives a lot of money to its investors, but often doesn't necessarily give them a lot of decision-making power. It's usually kept in the hands of the general partner who started the firm. Okay? Now, what does private equity do? So as we heard, private equity, what it does is it acquires firms, and then it attempts to fix the profitability of firms that were unprofitable until that point. The way it would do this is that it would acquire a firm, it would completely buy it. This is as opposed to some other risky investors that we'll talk about in a second, which don't necessarily buy the firm, they just invest in it. They get a voting share in it, or not even that. They just trade in assets related to a specific firm. PE doesn't do that. PE acquires the firm, or at the very least acquires a controlling share if it's a publicly listed firm. And PEs, what they would then do is that they would place the cost of the acquisition onto the firm itself once it's acquired. What does that mean? If I am a private equity firm and I just bought a big, shiny grocery store, I am going to place the cost of having bought that grocery store on the balance sheet of the grocery store itself that I'm now managing. So what I do in the first step is I send the grocery store into more debt because I want the grocery store to repay me for my acquisition of it. So I start by sending it into more debt. Then what private equity companies do is they ask themselves, what can I do at this point in order to make a plus? What can I do that will generate more value from this firm than the cost of acquiring it did? And they will do this in one of two ways. Either first, if the business is somewhat promising, they will attempt to introduce a lot of cost-cutting tactics. They will change the business structures to reduce costs substantially and increase profits if they think the problem with the business was just its inefficiency and its tendency to run high costs. If that's not the problem, and if the PE firm infers that there's nothing they could do in order to improve the company's attractiveness or make it a profitable company, what they will then do is they will start selling it for parts. So they will start selling the working contracts. They will start selling the place, the vending place, like the supermarket itself, the building. They will start selling the produce. They will start selling the trucks that the grocery store owns. And they will do that in an attempt to start making a higher profit by murdering this business than they did by acquiring it. Okay? So that's a good question. The reason is just that there is no one else. Like it's not that private equity is much less selfish than venture capitalists, for example, or hedge funds that we'll talk about in a second. It's just that private equity will often offer you a higher price because they know that they're not just investing and having a voting share in you. They are going to control you. So maybe you will get some other fund that asks to get 20% of your shares for $20. Private equity will tell you, we're going to acquire you for $60. And we're going to do that because we know that we can place the debt of the $60 on you once we acquire you, and that we can do whatever we want with you in order to get those $60. And other firms aren't like that, as in they don't do whatever they want after acquiring a specific stake in you because they don't buy you. Okay. So just some examples. Probably the most pronounced example is healthcare in the US, where private equity has multiplied by 6 the amount of acquisitions that it makes every year of private healthcare practices from 2014 to, I think it was 2024. And what they do in many healthcare practices is they have the same recipe book. They fire many staff members. They get rid of anything but the bare safety and regulations in hospitals. They cooperate with all sorts of insurance funds in order to have a specific insurance firm monopolize that clinic, and so they're able to charge higher fees for anyone that doesn't come from that insurance firm, and then they sort of divide those fees between themselves, the private equity firm, and the insurance fund. And all of these are very cost maximizing tactics. And there's also obviously the example of private equity in retail, so like with stores, etc., grocery stores, where they do the other sort of tactic I talked about, which is that they often will just use a lot of the physical components that the retail store has, like its trucks, its building, etc., and it will just start selling it massively for parts if it thinks the retail store is dead. So these are some examples. Cool. In terms of the other risky investors, the next risky investor is sort of the good fairy of risk investment, and that's VCs, venture capitalists. Venture capitalists, their business model is the idea that they, as firms, are smart at identifying who will rise up in the market and make purchases of stocks in those firms that are likely to going to rise in the market based on their knowledge of their growth potential. What do I mean by that? VCs are the sort of firm to say, I know to pick from a crowded room who's the best guy. And at this moment, this best guy doesn't know he's the best guy. So he's going to accept me when I tell him I want to be your agent for 20% of the cut, because he has no idea that he's the best guy. I will make him the best guy because I know to notice that he has that talent. This is sort of the analogy for how VC treats tech startups. Okay? VC wants to pick startups or any other company that is in its infancy, but often other companies don't have very high growth potentials if they're in their infancy. It's often startups that behave this way. And venture capitalists have a long-term horizon with these infants. They want to nurture them, develop them, invest in them for a period, And then once they become massive titans, they start reaping a lot of the benefits from having gotten those small tech startups to commit to a certain share of their profits being paid to the VC. And so the way that they do this is that they will do what's called angel funding. And angel funding is a model where you pick about 30 startups that you think have a shot after you meet with their directors, you hear their pitches, etc. And for most VCs, 2 or 3 of those 30 will rise up. 2 or 3 will become what we call unicorns, which is that they get a valuation of above $1 billion within 2 years, I think, of them being started or something like that. But even though it is just 2 out of the 30, that's enough for VCs because they start tapping in so early that the massive volumes of money that unicorns are able to generate cover for the amount of angel funding that they have to distribute initially for other actors, just because the assets are so much cheaper relatively at an early stage and are far, far outweighed by the profit that you get from investing in a correct tech firm. Okay? So the characteristics that this means about VCs is that, one, the most trustworthy VCs are often those who can pitch the best, that they know their shit about tech and about which firms to invest in, which is why the most successful VCs are people like Gary Tan and Y Combinator, because Gary Tan is the owner of a very successful tech firm. So they're able to be the ones that convince they have expertise. And that's how they draw a lot of funding into their models. The second thing is that they're interested in long term. So they often won't invest just for 2 years and then cash out. They'll often invest with a commitment to remain there for 10 years. Okay? Nice. The final sort of fund to talk about is hedge funds. Hedge funds are best compared to VCs because they're the sort of opposite. The way that they try to make value, they also try to make high profit. They're not like index funds or pension funds. But their high profit isn't made usually by investing in correct places for long periods of time. Their high profit is made through what we call trading. Trading is the process of using financial markets to your benefit in the sense of making all sorts of building a sort of process of trading in financial assets that's geared towards generating you more profit, even if the assets that you're trading themselves aren't necessarily assets that are more profitable than any other actor might be trading in. What do we mean by that? So hedge funds usually acquire assets with the wish to sell those assets at a profit. And they do this through what's called arbitrage. They have all sorts of tactics that allow them to buy underpriced assets that for whatever reason are being sold at a lower price. And they then sell those assets at their correct price or at a higher price in nanoseconds of their initial purchase. And they have other practices. Like, for example, what they might do is they have very often very complex investment and tech models. They have what's called HFT, high frequency trading models. And they use these automated models in order to, for example, dump a lot of assets at once in order to trick models of other firms to think that this asset's value is going to drop, even though they know that they're only doing it in order to drop the value. And so what that then does is it triggers other companies selling a lot of their assets. Then the hedge fund would acquire those companies' assets, knowing that the asset's value hasn't actually dropped and that they're just selling the asset in order to misinform other companies. So they do a lot of these sort of sneaky trading tactics in order to get a profit from their trading of assets. But it very rarely has to do with the asset itself being profitable. Okay? And indeed, that means that in terms of their characteristics, first, they're very short-termist. They don't really care if the company is going to go under next year, as long as they have some arbitrage that they can engage with right now. And the second is that they will often trade in more established assets. So they can often trade in the same assets that pension funds and index funds are buying, even stocks from the S&P 100, which are assets that private equity and VCs would never trade in. Hedge funds are able to trade in those assets because they're not attempting to make a high return from the asset itself. They're attempting to make a high return from the way in which they sell it. Retail investors are the final thing to talk about. Retail investors just refers to people who invest who aren't established funds. So this looks like people who invest through just downloading Robinhood in their app and starting to trade a little bit. And the main characteristic that they have, as you could imagine, is that they're quite stupid. They're not very good at assessing which companies are to be invested in. So they're much more privy to things like advertising or like biases from social media, etc. But also, since they don't have large amounts of money, that also influences the sort of assets that they're buying. So many times they don't have money to buy very highly expensive, stable assets like those in the S&P 500. Instead, they have to buy lower assets of more risky companies. So that's another characteristic of them. Okay. We're not, I think, going to talk about getting an IPO in banks now because we're running short on time. But if you guys have any questions, I do want to answer them.
I wanted to ask about this kind of induced demand effect for venture capitalists. So, if you know venture capitalists are in it for the long term, does that also influence other investors to invest, which like leads to this virtuous cycle of the things that venture capitalists invest in are necessarily likely to go up?
Exactly. Okay. So this is one of the things that is most influential on the tech sector. The entrance of venture capitalists has meant that many tech startups start by getting a venture capitalist to back them. Then they go to other investors and say, look, this venture capitalist thinks I'm smart and good. You should invest in me because they have also picked me. So this allows a sort of confidence stamp for many tech startups. Any other questions?
In general, how big is the retail investor market as compared to venture capitalists? Like just a estimate.
Much smaller. The retail investor market is rising very quickly. So I think retail investors are, there was a period, I think, in the early 2020s when retail investment was doubling itself every year in terms of the volume of investments that are being made through retail. But it's still smaller than VCs. It's smaller than VCs just because retail investors, even though there are many more of them than there are VC investors, are just not are exponential. VCs are just exponentially richer. They come with a lot of money from the startups and from the firms that they themselves own many times, and they're also able to raise funding. And so they're just much bigger funds than any money that could ever be accumulated by a very large amount of retail investors. By the way, a quick note I'll make is that actually for India in particular, retail investment is very, very big. And this is unlike many other markets where retail investment is a less central part of investment, for example, in the US. And more organized funds are more central.
Is that because India does not have venture capitalists or India just has more retail investors?
It's because India has more retail investors. The reasoning for which I actually don't know. If someone knows, feel free to jump in. But India saw a massive rise in retail investors over the past 10 years. And this is sort of replaced because at the same time, it saw also a very rapid rise of IPOs. So sort of you would expect there to be both more retail investors and also more established investors that invest into these new public firms. But you're actually, for some reason, not seeing that. You're almost only seeing that this rise in IPOs is being met with a rise in retail investment and not really an established investment.
Thanks.
Any other question? Okay, if there are no other questions, I guess we can call it a day. I hope you